Hello, my name is Tom Lovelace. I'm a London-based artist working across and between the spaces of performance and photography. I use these mediums to explore the ways in which we look, behave, represent and experience the world around us.
Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Priyesh Mistry. I'm the Associate Curator for Modern and Contemporary Projects here at the Gallery. It's a real treat to see so many of you joining us here this evening to kick-start the first in our series of unexpected new talks for 2022. And not only is it special because we are returning to do these talks live at the Gallery after so long, but also we kicked off with a fantastic performance that happened in this very room only moments ago this afternoon. So it's a real kind of treat that you were able to join us for that and for this talk this evening. So I'm joined here today by Tom Lovelace, a fantastic artist and photographer, in front of Seurat's The Bathers at Asnières, to hold a conversation about the work and to talk about how it's influenced Tom's practice, particularly in the performance work that we saw earlier this afternoon titled Bathers. I hope we can also explore some of the shared themes and ideas between the painting and Tom's practice, and also find out what has interested him, what first made him interested in this painting. So before I introduce Tom more formally, I just need to thank Hiscox for their support of this evening as the National Gallery's Modern and Contemporary partner. So it's wonderful to have you here, Tom. Tom studied photography at the Arts University of Bournemouth before studying art history and curating at Goldsmiths College here in London. His work explores the space between photography, performance and sculpture to create moments and images that are grounded in the reinvention of the everyday, of objects, materials and processes. For me, his installations provoke interesting questions to us, I think, as viewers, about what we understand about time and the encounters we experience within the gallery space. And I hope we can expand on some of these ideas during our discussion this evening. Tom's work has been featured in many exhibitions in the UK and across Europe, most recently known and strange at the V&A Museum here in London, Maison Européenne de Photographie in Paris, the National Museum of Art in Riga, Latvia, and at Atelier Noah in Norway, among many, many others. In recent years, he has been an artist in residence at the London South Bank University, the Yorkshire Sculpture Park, and Allegro projects in Switzerland. And this is not even mentioning the work Tom does as a curator, or as a lecturer teaching at the Royal College of Art, the University for the Creative Arts, and at Glasgow School of Art. I should also add that Tom, many years ago, in his many sort of hats, used to work here at the National Gallery. So it's a really special event tonight to actually have you here talking about your artwork or your practice. So, Tom, welcome. So to begin, I think our first question is always, how did you come to choose this work, and when did you first encounter it?
So my relationship with the painting has developed over many years, and that relationship started 20 years ago after I graduated. I worked here at the National Gallery for a year, and I spent a lot of time looking at this painting, and I suspect for anyone who's worked in museums, galleries or permanent collections, you'd be able to relate to the idea of building up relationships with particular paintings. And there's two or three that I used to go to either during my lunch hour or after work to spend some time looking at and trying to understand. And Bathers was one of them. And at the time, I used to come and sit in front of the painting and really kind of based on curiosity, attempting to spend some time with it and understand it as a composition and as an artwork. And so 20 years later, and so that moment was really special 20 years ago, and 20 years later, during lockdown, and during the pandemic I was developing an exhibition at Sid Motion Gallery in London, and the exhibition pivoted around ideas, or had a focus on ideas of looking and behaviour during lockdown, and surfaces and screens and isolation and all of those characteristics or experiences I'm sure we can relate to. And at that moment, this time last year, really, it became apparent really quickly that this painting was on my mind a lot. And the act of looking and the kind of intense relationships that we've all had over the last few years with communication and looking and surfaces and spaces that seem to oscillate between 2 and 3D, this painting was on my mind, and so that's when I started to revisit the painting this time last year, and that developed into an exhibition titled Bathers in the summer.
Do you want to describe a little bit about that exhibition and mainly the performance that happened then, but also that took place this afternoon here? And perhaps we can then lead in also talking about the painting, because I think there's so many connections that you draw out through the performance to the work.
Absolutely. So the exhibition took place last year, the original exhibition took place last year in June, and it's absolutely wonderful to be able to explore the same ideas this afternoon in this really exciting but really complicated space. As an artist trying to respond, normally we as students and artists, everyone has to respond to influence, and normally that response and that encounter takes place through books. And how does one respond to art history? So it's been really exciting, but equally awkward to try and respond to a key influence in real time in space. But the exhibition, essentially, last summer and today, is based on the idea of pictures which were rooted in, here's a fragment of one of them, so images which were inspired by 2 things. Firstly, this painting, but secondly, the surfaces that I kind of referred to a minute ago. So the dark, often greasy, dirty surfaces that one might find on one's phone, the laptop, and those spaces that flicker on and off. And so the exhibition last summer was based on the idea formally of not having any pictures on the wall. So the artworks on the floor, and myself and 3 performers essentially responded. So it's significant that the artwork is photographs. So if you think about the kind of the conventions or traditions that have structured photography, the history of photography, it's predominantly based on photographs in frames on walls, and it's a relatively passive act of looking. So essentially the exhibition tried to flip that and create a space where images were present to be looked at, but images were also accessible to the body, and images could be touched and images could be moved. And so performances took place where myself and 3 other performers interacted and responded to these images and these artworks on the floor through improvisation, and then afterwards the performances were almost gestures towards trying to entice the visitors to then step into the space and explore imagery, not only through one's eyes but through their bodies as well. And a key shift in the development from the work last summer, which was at Sid Motion Gallery in a white wall space, to this, where surrounded not only by 20 or 30 kind of key paintings in art history, but a painting that was a key influence in the development of the exhibition.
And there's one thing that was really interesting in sort of understanding this performance and really relating the idea of photography. You know, you touched on that idea of the history of photography, and not in just the way that it's kind of made, but also in the way that it's been traditionally presented on the walls. And there's something interesting about the idea of engaging and looking within a gallery space that I think your work really touches on and touches on the nuances and sort of shifts in a way. Just if we bring it to Seurat's the bathers at Asnières. It's interesting in that this work is also it shifts a lot of the kind of conversation that was happening around painting in the late 19th century, where you had many impressionists, who were painting en plein air, outside, usually on smaller canvases. We have numerous examples around us in room 43 at the moment. Seurat, he was very young when he painted it, at 24, so he was taking all these kind of languages of painting at that time and trying to find a sort of new way of sort of depicting the world around him. So not only just thinking about the way that perhaps the bourgeoisie were living everyday life, in the same manner that other Impressionist painters were doing, but also extending that a little bit more. So we know Seurat as a sort of as working in that pioneering technique of pointillism. Bathers was produced before he kind of went into that kind of mode of working. But what we see depicted is a scene of the working class workers having a break in the sun, resting on the banks of the River Seine. Asnières is a suburb just sort of northwest of Paris, and it was a location where it had many sort of roles in a way. One, it was a kind of location of sort of industry where you had factories and workers around, but also it was a location for the sort of middle classes from the centre of Paris to come out and spend their sort of pastimes. But instead of that scene, which Seurat has addressed in other paintings, we see the workers kind of having their moment in the sun. So this kind of idea of looking at a sort of part of everyday life that you wouldn't conventionally see in a painting, and of a painting of this scale. It's quite interesting to see a painting of this size painted in that kind of very modern, sort of progressive way. And it wasn't impressionistic in the traditional sense that it was reactive to a certain style of idea. It was painted in the studio. The composition was very thought out. But it was depicting this idea of something that was quite factual. And now at this time we know that photography was really developing. Kodak released their first camera, available commercially a few years after this painting was made. And there's a certain liberation in that, in the way that I think painters would approach painting up to that moment. But I think that relationship between sort of factual and sort of fiction, the idea of depicting a circumstance of everyday life that you might encounter, but in a particular way, is also, I think, a theme that I think you pick up in the performance of the bathers, particularly in the way that the performers are moving around, or what they might look at and observe.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if I can just quickly come in off the relationship that's thinking about fact or truth, especially photography. Photography's got a complicated relationship with that, but obviously photography's also got a really rich history around photographers trying to use the photograph as a way to deceive as well, and thinking about the kind of relationship between fact and fiction in photography. And obviously this painting, Industrial Revolution photography was having a huge influence on the way that the world was seen and the world was recorded, both across kind of society, but also in terms of art history, in terms of how artists, particularly painters, painting almost got turned upside down. But in terms of fact and fiction in the performance, it's an interesting one, because if you think about the idea of an image or a photograph, or the contents of a photograph almost being at arm's reach, metaphorically, literally, so the contents is something that one can't get hold of, as in we can encounter it and we can try and decipher it and pick it apart with our eyes. Whereas the bathers work that we produce today, so it's images that are on the floor that invite the viewers to interact with the image and to explore a different relationship with that. And so it's interesting to think about how and all the visitors seem to respond in very different ways. And the context is important. So I'm absolutely, the last 10 years I've been trying to develop an inquiry into the languages and the expanded languages and legacies of abstraction and minimalism. And in the pictures, there are contents in the pictures, in the baby performances, but the contents are quite hard to get to because they are quite subtle and they're rooted in this surface of blank. So that idea, so it'd be interesting to hear from visitors about how they interacted with that and that relating to the idea of representation and fiction and almost allowing visitors into that space. Essentially, that's what the performance tries to do, is to entice visitors into that space of photography, and then almost kind of leave them there to explore.
Can I come back to an earlier work of yours in which you kind of explore the idea of the sort of document of a sort of event that perhaps might have taken place or might not have? I think what's interesting about your practice, Tom, is that relationship between photography and the sort of performance of act. So you've been working on a series for the past few years under the sort of umbrella of living pictures. And if I can try and describe one of the prints, they document a moment in which that you've enacted in the space in which the photograph would be presented. And then for the exhibition, you encounter the photograph, and then there are elements within that where you realise that actually you're in the same space as where the photograph, or the moment when the photograph is being enacted. So there's this interesting play where you're suddenly, as a viewer, you realise that you're suddenly occupying a very different space in terms of what you might think of something as fiction being on a wall or inside a document, but then you're sort of living in that real space at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to follow on from that, so those works that were developed over a 6-7 year period were predominantly try to seek out site-specific spaces in which I could respond and create images that was. So, for example, if I was using this wall here, I would ideally come into the space 4 weeks beforehand, make an image, a photograph, go away, print the photograph, frame the photograph, and then display the photograph on the same site that the image is made. So so it's compulsory as the act, within the act of viewing the image, visitors or the audience need to step into the space in which the image is made. And so that kind of structured my practice for many years. And in the last 3 or 4 years, the contents that were in the pictures, that were distilled in the pictures, and predominantly bodies that were performing for the camera. In the last 3 or 4 years, this collection of work titled The Living Pictures has been unfolding, where bodies have slipped out of the image and I've been trying to create some fluid spaces where agency is, there's a space for agency for both performers and audiences to explore images in hopefully these kind of fluid ways.
Can you expand on that a little bit? Because I want you to also sort of tell us about your interest in the way that we're interacting with the performances, particularly through the images that we might take on our phones. One thing that was really interesting about the performances here today is that, everybody was out with their phones sort of recording it or showing it, but then, also posting those images online. Can you talk a little bit about your interest in the way that images of certain moments, performances, particularly of your work, could expand and circulate?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because for the first 10 years of my practice, I was all concerned with trying to create a subject or to amend or manufacture or readjust a subject, with the idea being that the camera was the audience. So this would happen in private spaces. So the framing, obviously that's what photography does wonderfully, in a very complicated way. It frames something, so you have an image, but equally what is outside the frame, what the image maker decides not to leave in the frames, is of equal importance and complicated. So that relationship of framing environments and subject has always been really important for me. And what was unexpected in the performances last summer and here was that a key ambition for the work was to try and create that unexpected space where visitors would walk into a gallery space, and opposed to images being on the wall, images on the floor. So, okay, what do I do now? How do I respond to that? And the ambition was to try and create an unexpected space where relationships would be explored with photography. But what was unexpected is most people got their telephones out and started to make images of the process. And both last summer and I kind of performing today, but I got a glimpse. A lot of people had their phones out, taking photographs, and I presume filming. So they were behind the lens. So there was a different layer, a different space of photography that kind of entered the work, which was unexpected.
And there's something interesting about them thinking about the documents of those performances. So very much in the way that we've touched on the Living Picture series, and that being a document of an event that not necessarily was open to everybody, but now you have this sort of document of the work, or the work itself kind of being out there within that kind of sort of those so virtual but social spaces. That kind of brings me on to the sort of next question, really thinking about Seurat's Bathers, and I think something that you sort of touched on in the work as well in our previous conversations about the way in which these figures very sort of statically, they're very modelled in a sort of very fixed way, almost kind of like classical sculpture. But the way that they seem to be sort of looking at nothing or at something at the same time, there's this sort of quite serene nature about that idea of the observing something or observation during a sort of period of sort of downtime and recreation. Painting is very much a comment about recreation during the late 19th century between different classes. Here we see the workers relaxing in the sun, but in the distance you see this boat where you would have middle-class visitors. We see a middle-class couple, bourgeoisie, who have come out from Paris to spend their sort of weekend relaxing on the Seine at Asnières and taking a boat trip out. And it's very much a kind of a comment on that kind of difference of how you might spend your spare time. And today, what we do is we often spend a lot of time walking through galleries, coming to the National Gallery to look at paintings, to look at pictures, to look at photographs if you're going to different kinds of museums. So there's also this, I think you're bringing the work in here is a really interesting idea of sort of asking people to understand that process of looking in a different way.
Yes, absolutely, and I suspect there was perhaps two areas or types of audience that were present this afternoon. One, in the first instance, of people coming specifically to see the performance because they'd heard about it or maybe seen the exhibition last summer. And then secondly, visitors that were coming and had no idea the performance was taking place or didn't care about the performance and were coming to look at paintings, and in which case, hopefully we presented an interesting, engaging, meaningful space where painting and photography and bodies and looking and being was an interesting space to be in. That was the hope or the ambition of the work.
Yeah.
And so hopefully we achieved that.
I think we did achieve it. It was quite interesting and brilliant to see the performance kind of evolve in the space, especially as it was repeated a few times over the afternoon, where we kind of experimented also with the way that the audience kind of entered and navigated the space and observed.
Can I just add one thing? Really interesting to talk about composition, because it's a really distinct, concise composition. So at the beginning, when you're referring to the kind of almost serene, silent, kind of quiet space of contemplation that's taking place. At the beginning of the performances, there's a 2 or 3 minutes. The performances are improvised. there's a 2 or 3 minute period where the performers are static in the gallery with the photographs on the floor and the painting, and then, so it's improvised. What was interesting for me was the first 2 or 3 minutes, the static composition both exists in the painting, but in the space here, and the photographs, a kind of important piece of detail for each performance, brand new, fresh, slick, untouched, pristine photographs were on the floor. And then during the performance, what unfolded was almost body images became embodied, and images. One of the performers described it, one of the performances, as being quite fleshy. So the initial static, still quiet composition then unfolded in unexpected ways. But quite often that silence was broken, both by bodies moving, by people taking photographs, but also the sound of the paper, which is unexpected. So thinking about the relationship between photography and sound is again a really interesting one. But sound became an important part of the work.
That brings me on to the final question that I wanted to ask you about the kind of process of printing and making the work. I touched on before that Seurat was, working that pioneering technique of pointillism much later on in his career. But what's interesting about this work, firstly, it's much larger scale than other kind of impressionists were working at that time. But also, he made several sketches and worked up several kind of compositions for the work, testing out, planning out the way that he would compose the work and how it would, what figures would sit, and the place of figures within that. Here at the National Gallery, we're very fortunate to hang some of those oil sketches next to the work, so you see that kind of interesting relationship between the painting and Seurat's thinking before. But what's also interesting about this work is that after a few years, even after Seurat first showed the work, he revisited it and supplemented it with several details. Firstly, we think that the boat was an addition that he made a few years later, but also he came back and added dots. So I invite you to come up and have a look at the painting after the discussion. But you see that particularly around the hat of this man standing here, where he's come back and added that technique of pointillism in several dots in this area around his hat, but also particularly around the hat that is resting on the bank in the centre of the painting. So that idea of kind of looking back and reworking your process is really interesting, particularly, I think, for Seurat, he was less interested in that kind of idea of the immediate impression of a scene, but more kind of meticulous in the way that he was adopting scientific ideas around optical mixing of colours and planning his paintings for this scale. And there's something interesting also about the process of making photographs, so it's taking them, planning a photographic shot, taking the film, processing it in the darkroom, and then producing sort of prints. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the kind of actual prints that you're using within the performance and within this work, because they are exposed prints, aren't they? They're highly exposed, which gives them that kind of dark, black, deep colour, but closer up you see the kind of nuances of an image. Not quite sure what that image is, but there is a sort of image within the prints.
Absolutely. The making of the images was extremely difficult because, as I referred to, the references of screens that are turned off and the screens that are the kind of anticipation for the screen to turn on. But it's in that moment that screen sits between 2 and 3D, and so it was a really difficult task trying to create an image that sat between representation and abstraction, an image that allowed visitors into the image. And I worked for about 2 months with artist Tom Lovelace, who's based in London, trying to create pictures, but actually almost ironically, the final image files that we used were fragments from my telephone. So they're almost low resolution images that sit between something and nothing. And so that was really important. It was important that viewing the floor prints from a distance, that one couldn't properly understand them from a traditional space of viewing. So the images require this process and require this process, and what happens here is interesting. The first thing you see is yourself, and then there's different options in terms of how you might navigate now. So the images inside the contents of the images were really important. It was important that they sat between something and nothing, they gestured towards something. And I think what was really exciting about today was not only there was an exploration of what was in the pictures, but then the paintings reflected in the pictures. So hopefully there was an interesting kind of intense dynamic floating around and kind of shaping those acts of looking.
And I think that's interesting that you talk about that kind of sense of being in betweeners when you're looking at a virtual screen, something that essentially is sort of flat but has a depth as soon as you turn it on. It's a sort of interesting kind of thing. And we see this in Seurat where, you understand the composition, is receding into the background. You buy these kind of diagonals that he's using in the painting. But what's interesting about this is that this work it's totally modern in the way that actually you see the brush strokes, you see the kind of colours that he's using, and you see the surface essentially of the canvas. So there's this interesting sort of play there, and great that we were able to actually see the kind of reflection of the painting within your prints as well. So there's an extra layer of kind of thinking about depth and reflection and viewing and seeing, particularly with this kind of shimmering river that Seurat kind of paints in this work.
Absolutely, and following on from that, what's interesting is the not second life of the images, but what happens after the pictures and after the performances close. Because the images exist for this kind of live fluid space, but now I've got lots of pictures that hold the original image, but also hold the traces of the movements, the gestures, the bodies, and the images used in performances are predominantly bigger than one's body. So again, kind of thinking about relationship with pictures and how do we negotiate kind of scale and that size. Since the exhibition last summer at Sid Motion, what I've been exploring is what do I do with these pictures now? What's their currency? And one strategy was to invert this relationship of scale. So by cutting the images up into very small, intimate fragments of the performance, which now sit within the palm of one's hand. And so, again, questioning or testing, experimenting with those relationships with the image, with photography, with materiality, but in a different way. So the shapes of the photographic prints, the role of the shapes is supposed to be twofold. So in the first instance, the shapes were to echo or to gesture towards the riverbank, towards space and nature, and in the summer when we first did the exhibition, that was really important because the exhibition took place in the Whitehall Gallery space, and it was wonderful because there's a windowsill within Sid Motion Gallery that started off a conversation about this. So last summer we used the windowsill at a riverbank almost, and so during performances, myself and other performers used that as a way of gaining height and looking down. And so, but the shapes of the pictures in that exhibition were really important as a way of gesturing towards the river or gesturing towards a stone or a natural form essentially. so that's where, so those forms were developed there. They also have relationships with my kind of wider work, thinking about the role of minimalism and our relationship with the kind of history of this language. And so making or cutting the prints for this display this afternoon was really difficult because in the summer the painting wasn't there. Now the painting is there. But I decided the right thing to do was to develop to play upon a continuation of those forms, so they gesture towards spaces within the painting. But also it's important that they're ergonomical. And they relate to the body in some ways. So during the performances, for those of you who are here or may see images afterwards, the shapes are there to be almost props for the body to respond to. But significantly, there's a straight, clear, kind of machine-cut edge to the majority of them. So one hopefully can never get away from the frame and the photograph and that printing process. So it kind of sits between those two spaces, in opposed to if I were to get a Stanley knife and completely cut a natural form out of it. I think that would maybe be too easy. It would be removed from the rectangle and the square, which is so important in our history, essentially.
Yeah, and interesting to think about that scale in the way that we think about technology and how technology is made to have this on the hand as well.
Yeah.
Tom, on that note, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us this evening for tonight's Unexpectedly talk, but also presenting your performance within the gallery. So please join me in thanking you very much.